Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jimmy McGing, and as Chairman of the RDS Committee of Enterprise, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the RDS studios. We are delighted to be able to host this webinar from our wonderful new asset as part of our Vision 2030 series of talks. We expect to be using these studios for some time yet before we can return to in-person meetings. So please subscribe to the RDS YouTube channel to be kept informed of future events in this series. The RDS Vision 2030 series aims to harness the insight and expertise of thought leaders, influencers and innovators to identify the challenges and opportunities facing Ireland over the next decade. The focus is firmly on the future and what Ireland can do to ensure economic, environmental and social sustainable development. Today, we are delighted to welcome two of Ireland's leading biotech innovators and entrepreneurs, Dr. Cormac Kilty and Professor Luke O'Neill, as they discuss their careers and thoughts on the future of the biotech section in Ireland. However, Luke is more than just an expert. He's an entrepreneur. His team have created a new molecule, have brought it through what used to be known in the venture capital world as the Valley of Death, where many good ideas die from a lack of liquidity. Luke's team came out the other side and found a buyer. Dr. Cormac Kilty is Associate Professor at UCD and Chair of the Research Committee of the Irish Cancer Society. He has made a name for himself as someone who is familiar with the route of the entrepreneur, who has taken several companies through the Valley of Death, and who knows the road well enough to be a guide. Cormac and Luke have known each other for a significant number of years, not breaking any secrets there. And we're looking forward to seeing a fascinating conversation between two men who in many ways have walked the same path. Please feel free to join the conversation today by emailing your questions to enterprise@rds.ie. And my colleague John Whelan, who's Vice Chair of the RDS Enterprise Committee, will put as many of these questions as we can to Cormac and Luke after their initial conversation. So, without any further delay, I'll now hand you over to Dr. Cormac Kilty and Professor Luke O'Neill. Gentlemen, over to you.
Thank you, Jimmy. Thank you very much. Good to be in the RDS. I'm part of the Enterprise Committee rollout, which I think they do a great job. As always, it's a pleasure to sit with Luke and chat about science, which we've been chatting about for rather a long time. I hope at the end of our chat today, our members will see that Irish biotech is really in a pretty good shape. A lot done and a lot more to do, if we use an old slogan. But one of the things I'd like to maybe change the title slightly, Luke, if you don't mind. And I think biotech people mostly think about drugs and diagnostics, but there's an awful lot more goes on in Ireland in what we call life sciences. If you talk to Enterprise Ireland, they put all of this sector into life sciences. And there's a number of sectors. We do have 270 companies in the total life science area. These are medtech, we call, which is developing medical devices like heart valves, diagnostics, precision engineering. We have a big pharma, veterinary drug production group and drug discovery. Pharma services, Luke, people forget about, which would be clinical trials, supporting the industries here. And then chemical clusters, which make a lot of the raw materials that go into the multinational productions. So all of this falls into life science. It needs roughly the same number of graduates or types of graduates. We are about 10,000 employees in Irish life science, and we export €2 billion a year. There's over 85 companies in the foreign direct investment, the ones we would hear about all the time, Eli Lilly and Roche. They have about 25,000 employees. We have 50 FDA-approved manufacturing sites here, which is fantastic. And we export that group about 10 billion. And looking at the numbers of our exports in the Irish Times this morning, 12 billion is about 10% of our total exports. So this is not insignificant. So I like this term life science. It's quite broad, but it covers everything. So, Luke, it's great to chat with you. Can I first congratulate you and your colleagues on winning the emerging section of Entrepreneur of the Year last Thursday with your new company, which is fantastic. But I think to talk about where Irish biotech and life sciences are going, we probably need to chat a bit about how we got started. So you have a strong academic career. How did you get interested in commercialization?
Yes, how long have you got, Cormac? I could talk about myself all day, couldn't I? But well, I guess it was all about my PhD in a way, because I've always worked on inflammation since the get-go in many ways. I began with Crohn's disease, for example, back in '85, which seems like a long time ago now. And when you work on inflammation, you're interested in therapeutics, of course. My PhD was all about non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, for instance, dexamethasone. I worked on that as part of my PhD, which is now in COVID, of course. I was always interested in new medicines, I guess. And then, of course, if you do basic discovery, which I do, that's my main thing, remember, you want to make it real if you can, and gradually began to work on, I guess you might call it commercialization. It began for me with Big Pharma, would fund a postdoc in my lab, maybe in Trinity, or a PhD student. And that was satisfying up to a point, but of course I didn't own any of that. It was contract-based. And talking to you, of course, I began to wonder, would there be a better way to do it? And if you're an academic, you have two choices. Either you license your technology through IP, or a product or a service, I guess, or you build your own company and you license it into your own company. And then that began with Opsona, of course, back in 2003. And that's much more satisfying because you're more involved and it's your ideas and you can drive it in a different way, I guess. So, but I guess my research area lent itself to commercialization, I suppose. And the other big thing to say, which is, as you would agree, is a key bottom line, a massive need here. We're talking about the biggest disease that afflicts humanity, and it could be Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, arthritis. I worked on rheumatoid in my PhD, for instance. So I knew there was a big appetite, and Big Pharma had a big appetite as well. There's no point in trying to commercialize something nobody wants. Let's face it, So you got to think of a way to make your stuff relevant. And the last thing I'd say in answer to your question overall would be, I'm a scientist first and foremost, so I want to make discoveries. And that in itself is satisfying, remember. I could have been an astronomer, but I don't care about a distant galaxy necessarily. I'm not knocking astronomy, but the fact that my research could make a difference was the great add-on. And the only way to do that is through interacting with industry, really, to make that real, I suppose. So that was always in my mind from early on, I would guess, Mm-hmm.
Good, no, great. But I do remember you saying a week or two ago when you and your colleagues sold Inflammasome, the more recent fantastic development, and people were asking about how much money everybody would make, and it's great to make a few bob. But I think one of the first answers you had is it's for patients. Yeah. And I think this is the really interesting thing about a lot of my fellow entrepreneurs in this space is they think of patients.
Yeah, that's very important. Well, that's the ultimate goal, of course. I mean, in the back of my mind, always was making a difference for patients. Very difficult to achieve, as you know, Cormac. It's very hard to get a new medicine. It's almost, I said somewhere, it's like climbing Everest backwards kind of thing. It's almost impossible, isn't it? Yeah. But absolutely, and the thrill of Inflammasome. Of course, it was a good return for the investors and us as employees and all the rest. We wouldn't downplay that. But more important to me was this will now go to the clinic, and Roche will now run multiple clinical trials. Yeah. And in case people don't know, each trial is going to cost them at a minimum 300 million. This is a phase 2 trial, right? To take a single drug to market, as you know, Cormac, is about 1.1 billion, right? And many fall over. Yeah. Now, you can't get that money off a venture capitalist. It's too much. A bank certainly won't give it to you. You've got to go to Big Pharma. They've got the deep pockets to invest, and of course Roche are a good example. They're very keen to make new medicines, you see. So, but you're dead right. It's all about the patient's ultimate, the need. Yeah. In other words, you would be the same as me. I guess I didn't get into other things because I knew I really wanted to head in that direction with my biomedical research. But you'd have the same view, wouldn't you? I presume. I mean, your motivation was similar.
Yeah, I'm very interested. All the work we do is focused on patients. But you were asking me earlier how I got started. It's interesting because I went to college to become a marine biologist. Yeah. I did zoology and minored biochemistry at UCD. And speaking to the chairman earlier, I realized I went to UCD 50 years ago next year, which is a bit frightening. But I was very interested in biochemistry, like you. How do cells work? They're amazingly complex. But I wanted to become a marine biologist. But my old friend, and still great friend, Dr. Paddy Joyce from UCD, came back from the University of Texas to join the faculty. And he gave a seminar on how to use enzyme proteins to treat certain types of cancer. And this blew me away. I mean, I never realized that we could use biochemistry with patients or cancer. So I went up to him after the lecture. 5 minutes later, I decided to work with him. And I did my PhD with him, where I learned all of the techniques of protein chemistry, which are all the techniques we use today in the biotech life science industry. And then I ended up at the University of Texas, learning how to clone genes. So I learned, rather than starting from interest in particular things like information, I was very much more techniques. Learned a lot from his lab and from meeting people like he shared a lab with Jim Allison, last year's Nobel Prize winner in medicine. So in Texas, there was a lot to learn. But eventually, my wife said to me, you can't spend time in academia, because we were relatively broke. And I ended up getting a job in Switzerland in Baxter Diagnostics. And this is where the link, what I always say, I'm in the business of science. You're in the business of science, but maybe a little bit more loaded on the science. So like many of my entrepreneur colleagues in Ireland, they've all spent some time in multinationals or larger companies. And that's very important, because you learn discipline, like discipline of financing. You know, how not to run out of money, you know, when you're in the valley of death, as Jimmy said. How to work with other people. I mean, manufacturing, it's great to do experiments in the lab, but then you have to transfer it to manufacturing. But the other interesting thing was that you mentioned licensing. Back in the 80s, Europe was really not developing much biotech. America was miles ahead of us. You had Amgen and Biogen. And I ended up in charge of business development in Europe for Baxter, where we licensed and bought some technology. But if you went to Germany, there was nothing like biotech development compared to America. Loads of wonderful science. And we licensed some of that. And the Germans just weren't interested to leave academia and start a company. So I got the idea of licensing, and then, so I didn't do research in university. And so the two companies we started, we always licensed in technology. As you said, but that for the people we licensed it from was their best way to get it to patients. And it worked out pretty well. But to go back to when you started getting interested in commercialization, what was the view of the universities at the time? I mean,
it was a bit negative.
It's changed a little bit.
It's a strange one. Your senior colleagues go, don't do that. That's a bit dirty somehow. Or a bit kind of, you know, you're an academic. You should be this purist, you know, whereby you're. I mean, the mission of universities changed, Cormac. I mean, the first mission was education, obviously. The second mission became research. That was in the 50s and 60s that really took off around the world. And they were the two main missions. If you stepped outside that, you were kind of defying those two key things, you see. The third became commercialization. Because why wouldn't a university, you know, benefit from the research going on in it? Money should flow back into the system, you see, as opposed to someone else benefiting. But many academics would say, oh no, that wouldn't be what we do really. You know? Now remember, many of our colleagues in the university aren't in the sciences. They're the ultimate purists in a way, you know. So they'd look down. They wouldn't look down on you, but they would see it as a very different activity, I suppose. Now, meanwhile, the other lot, I guess in America, it began to change. I went to Cambridge for a number of years. Many of my contemporaries went to the US, no more than you've been saying. That's where the action was. And they began to make a lot of money, you see. So academics thought, oh, I could make money, maybe. And as I said earlier, that wouldn't be the prime motivation. But why wouldn't universities recoup some of the investments, you see? You get to have a virtuous circle happening there. But it takes a specific skill set, and many academics don't have it. And many can't learn it either, by the way. Like, and you know yourself, you could put an academic in front of a bunch of investors, and within a minute they're bored. You know, others are able to do it. You see, and I was lucky enough to be able to do it, I suppose. So it's not as straightforward as it seems in a way, is it?
I tell the story. It's interesting. When we started the company Biotech, I went to London to raise funds, and I remember going to the first venture capitalist I went in front of. They had a fund of about 10 or 20 million. And I had products that were going to be very good, I thought, for liver transplantation. So I stood up in front of them and I gave this basic scientific seminar. And during my seminar, the lead guy got up and walked out.
Yeah.
Right? Just walked out. And there's two acolytes.
You learned your lesson there, can't you?
These two acolytes were, you know, kind and pleasant and put up with me. And I was with my accountant, and when I walked out, I said, we clearly did something wrong.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And what investors want to see is they want to know you understand the science.
Yep.
But as I say to people presenting for funders, by slide 3 or 4, you should be telling them how they're going to make money.
Yeah. Well, it's a real skill, isn't it? I mean, the truth is, to explain something scientific and complicated isn't easy anyway. Let's start with that. Yeah. To do it to the public is difficult enough, actually. I do a lot of this public stuff.
And you do a very good job.
But explaining it to investors is a different skill entirely. And you got to try. My great joke was treat them like 9-year-olds, effectively. And they're very smart people, though. So you can't overdo it either. But there's way, and you had a real skill, but you must have learned that skill. Did you learn that in Baxter, do you think?
No, I probably learned it in Cork or something where I was. I have no idea.
You were younger.
But the. I do say I was lucky that my first venture capitalist walked out and not my 100th, because the slap in the face was so big I had to figure it out. And it took about 2 or 3 years before we got a bit slicker at it. Yeah. And I don't know, I think, I've always enjoyed lecturing and so on, like yourself, and so maybe you develop some sort of skill for it. But you need to tailor your presentations for the audience. Yeah. I know when I gave presentations in the US, I used to say aluminum, and I used to say Caribbean. I used to try and not sound too non-American.
But one thing, if ever you need a team, remember, so I was always good. I could do the science bit at the start. But then there was someone with me to do the business bit, you see. And both of us had equal credibility in a way. And you need both. An academic can't do it all, remember. The academic who goes into entrepreneur stuff has to be aware of the business stuff and answer some questions occasionally. But you're saying, now I'll hand to my colleague now. Yeah. Give you our 5-year plan here and our financial plan.
And we see that all the time. When I started, I was lucky because I had that experience with Baxter in the multinational. So I could present numbers and so on and so forth. But as soon as you get to the next phase, you need a team. There's no discussion. And when we look at, I'm involved in a number of investor groups here in Ireland, and when we look at presentations, we need to see the team. Yeah. If there's a founder who's doing it all on his or her own and thinks they can do it all on their own, we won't have a second meeting. Yeah. Because it's very hard, as you say, to get to a success.
And one thing I learned was the word diligence, which I wouldn't have been aware of before this. Due diligence.
Due diligence.
And if you're any academics listening in, they will do diligence on you till it's coming out the wazoo. An investor will not give you money unless there's full diligence. And in my case, and Manus Rogan, one of our great supporters, and I wouldn't have known him from Adam, he would have rung around 4 or 5 immunologists who tell me about Luke O'Neill, And if they'd said he's a bit of a waster, that's the end of the investment, kind of. It's very important, isn't it? Yeah. So in other words, if you're going to get into it, as the scientist, you better have a good reputation. You better have a good track record. Yeah. That's empirically valid, Otherwise, you won't get the investment either,
And we can chat later, I think, to finish up what are the key things about what you need to start a company. But I think now we have a rather good ecosystem in Ireland for life science development. I don't know what your view on. The universities have changed. So because they need funding, a lot of the Science Foundation Ireland funding that comes in requires impact statements. You've got to say, what am I going to do with it? Now, I know you and I discussed quite a lot whether or not we should be doing more blue sky funding than applied funding. And I think we probably will agree there's a bit of both. One of the things you cannot do in a lab is schedule discovery. Okay. Once you get into manufacturing or something like that, you can schedule a bit more. But what about the infrastructure that's developed?
Yeah, well, I must give my university a big shout out, to be honest. Trinity's very supportive, tremendous. They leave you alone is the first thing, actually, sort of. In other words, get on with it. Come to us if you need help, kind of thing. But they can be proactive as well. They can approach you and go, well, I've got a potential licensor here, for instance. But then once Inflazome, which is my best example, began rolling, they were very good. And the deal they negotiated with the University of Queensland and the investors was excellent, So that was real. I didn't need to worry about that, So full praise for them, really. And Trinity, I know Trinity most of all. I know the other universities are similar. Of course, we're all quite the same, really. There's a great culture of it, And there are good success stories that you can draw on to say, look, it worked for that company. This one could work next, kind of thing, And tomorrow, I'm meeting with our provost. So Trinity have got some income from the deal because they were shareholders. And me and the provost are going to sit down on Thursday to see how will we use that money now to encourage others to do it. So it's very proactive, which is fantastic. Yeah. They can't really help you raise money, though. I mean, I would say that's the bit that's missing, maybe. And Trinity tried to raise a fund of its own. UCD did as well. And there was a period when there was joint fund between them. It'd be good if universities had more money to invest, because that would help other investors join the party. And if we hadn't had Fountain, actually, as the Irish investor, we couldn't have got international finance. So the international VCs want a local one to help, and that was a key part of the debate. And Fountain fulfilled that role very well. You didn't need to do it necessarily, but that might be something.
But you were unusual that a venture capitalist went in early.
Yeah.
Normally, the angel investors will go in early, seed funding, taking a bit more risk, getting the odd very small tax break, something we can talk about if we want to grow more startups.
Yep.
The tax system is very bad here. Yep. But I do think that if you look at Nova UCD, which is a knowledge transfer area, Enterprise Ireland has invested quite a lot in these organizations who will help startups. We have one in most of the universities. They've also launched Knowledge Transfer Ireland, which I think is a fantastic resource. Anybody should look it up. Knowledge Transfer Ireland will actually try and sell some of your licenses. But what they've also done is they've tried, and I think been reasonably successful, to streamline those contracts that you talked about when you have investors or companies coming into the university. I think in Ireland, I never seem to have much trouble on the continent or in America, but when I started off in Ireland, there was great difficulty negotiating with universities. And I think it's mainly because the people weren't particularly experienced. And always wanted too much money, of course, when we always want slightly less money. So to have a unified theory, to have a similar platform that most universities will use, I think will be very helpful.
I'll give you one example that's really good. So I have lots of stuff with GlaxoSmithKline over the years as a consultant, and it works very well for the university because they train our students. 3 of my PhD students went to GSK to be trained, you know. They funded 2 PhDs in my lab, and our students learned from GSK all kinds of skills. So it's really a two-way street. But the contract that was negotiated to fund GSK-based joint research in my lab, GSK were in awe of Trinity. I hate to give Trinity a big shout out. They said dealing with Cambridge is really difficult. Trinity were very facilitatory. Really? They made it, not in a way that they're losing out, by the way. Some universities are so protective. And Australia suffers from this, strangely. It's awful dealing with Australian universities, apparently, because they want to hold on to everything, and valuation can be problematic. I think Irish universities do a really good job at contract negotiation.
Well, I think that, you know, it's so risky starting any company, but in life sciences, that the sooner you get it out there and not worry about greed. This is the same with investors. We always have to be careful of greed. But get it out there, get the team, get some seed funding, and see does it have a chance. And a bit like the bookie, somebody who bets a lot, we don't tell too much about all the companies that fail.
That's right.
And luckily we have enough that keep going. But I think Enterprise Ireland has done an enormous amount. I know IDA have attracted a lot of companies. And when we sell an Enterprise Ireland-based company, it goes over to IDA, so that's always an interesting local discussion. But I'm involved in a number of startup companies, and one of the great things that Enterprise Ireland has brought now is the Commercialization Fund. So we might talk about funding in a while, in that if you can raise, let's say, 250,000 from friends, family, whatever, if it's a reasonable idea, the plan has to look sensible to the evaluators in Enterprise Ireland. They will match that fund. So to get anything off the ground, let's say between $500,000 and 1.5 million, is fantastic, particularly in the non-pharma. As you said, with drugs, you tend to have to move much bigger. But in medical devices and diagnostics, my field, you can get a lot of evidence pretty quickly. So I think they do a great job. And then you have Science Foundation Ireland, as you know, has 16 different knowledge centres at our universities around the country, some of them in life sciences. And hopefully, and some of them have spun out, the companies, there's no doubt. So I would be pretty happy with the infrastructure. I think we definitely could do more, and I think Trinity is...
I think we probably need more outstanding science as well, remember, because the real added value here is the blue skies discovery, by the way, because that can bring huge value. If you discover a new target in cancer and you own that target, that will be extremely valuable. If you just do an add-on or a little, a couple of steps down the road towards something which is very competitive, it's less valuable. Now, the trouble is, as we've discussed before, you can't predict blue skies research. It pops up. The famous phrase by Max Perutz, one of my great heroes in Cambridge, he said, discovery cannot be planned. It pops up like Puck. I remember the Shakespeare thing. So it's very difficult to plan for that. And it can be very expensive with no return as well. So you need guts for the company. And SFI deserve credit over the years. They began by building the research base, by the way, just get more outstanding research going. and reputation begins to grow, and gradually stuff begins to, it's a long game, let's put it that way, isn't it? Let's face it.
Would you do things differently or ask for different things to try and get us to do more blue sky?
I think SFI made a slight mistake.
Am I not coming through that?
Yeah.
I think they made a slight mistake when the country's economy began to tank, as we all remember. SFI had to shift its policy towards job creation and closer to markets. Understandably, we can't criticise them for that, because the politicians are going, what are we spending all this money on? The country's in its bits, this kind of thing. The needle has to shift back more and more, is the trick here, really, in a sense. And it goes back to just the only principle should be fund excellence, actually. It doesn't matter what the excellence is, in some ways. If you fund excellent people, they will deliver and they will make a difference, either just basically in terms of research or indeed in translation and commercialization. So I think they should just go back to funding excellence.
Yeah.
And bring in more excellent people. It's a numbers game in the end, Cormac, as you know. I mean, it really is.
It's always this trade-off of, and I don't disagree. I don't think that everything we do should have some view of applied, because well, you never know what's around the corner. Yeah. But I do think, wearing my industrial hat, is that being in the business of science, the big sin to me is that if we come across something that's really going to be useful with patients, that we don't put the wherewithal behind it to bring it from the lab to the patient. That's a big sin. Yep. And I think the technology transfer offices at the college and Enterprise Ireland have a big role to play to help that.
Yep.
And to help startups. And not everything will make it there. And then whether we sell the company or whether we license it is, I don't think makes an enormous amount of difference. I know we'd like to grow bigger companies in the country. So to spin out a company, one of the things that I'm always saying, and you've heard me say this, that the first thing you need is data, the second thing you need is data, and the third thing you need is data. And particularly when I worked in biomarkers, we developed some very novel biomarkers for kidney and liver damage, and we didn't actually do very well in the marketplace. And the data for some of them wasn't strong enough to convince the physicians, because remember, if you're trying to launch a new product, you're actually trying to change the way medicine is practiced. The doctor has to change his or her practice. And not all of the grants that I see or the startups have enough basic data already in the lab. I know what your view on that.
Agree entirely, yeah. Again, diligence, it comes down to, because they look at the data in great detail. They're in my lab looking at our lab book sometimes and show me that data again and make sure it's real, So it is driven by, it starts with the idea, then you get the data to back up the idea. The more data you have, the better, obviously, because then there's more confidence in the whole proposition. Yeah. And that's where great science, see the best scientists are basic scientists, by the way, because they know they got to get great data to discover something brand new that holds up, you see. So hence, if you invest in basic research, you get the best training as well, by the way. And then people get their PhDs, they go on and form businesses, even though the academic who has the basics of mightn't. I think the training bit is extremely important as well, you think?
Yeah. No, I think, and one of the other suggestions I make to my academic colleagues is to try and develop data or prototypes, or whatever it is, with as much other people's money as you possibly can get.
That's exactly right.
You don't want to start a company very early, because then you have to get a company secretary, you have to register it, and so on and so forth. So there are a lot of grants available. You have to compete for them, but using grant money to develop data so that you have a much stronger position when you go out gives you a better chance of success, because you've ameliorated the risk as well. Yep. So I'm a big person on data and using other people's money. And we've been very successful as a country in European funding.
Yep.
The 2020 program, I think per capita, we probably have more money coming in. And all of our colleges have been particularly successful. And now the new 2020 program is all about disruptive science. So it's going into all forms of electronic bio, wearing your Fitbit and all that type of thing.
Yep. No, we've got to be proud of, you're right. I think there's a great cohort of scientists in Ireland, actually.
Yeah.
More would make it even better, kind of, the usual kind of thing, I suppose. And then the education system is actually great, I think, as well, which feeds into that. People comment on my students who go overseas, that person was trained very well, So that's something else to be proud of.
Yeah. Well, I think you know, when we look at 25,000 FDI and 10,000 here, we need more graduates.
Yeah.
And when you're talking to your graduates and you see them coming through, let's say at the undergraduate level, do they have any sense of what's out there in terms of jobs, or do they tend to look for...
We could do more on that, Cormac. Do more on that, I think. Yeah, because most academics are a bit tunnel visioned in that regard. Now, there are efforts. Our PhD programs have entrepreneurial units in them now, for instance, and they can take that as an option. So we're very well aware of this. I suspect we could get them. I mean, these young people are fantastic, remember. They want to form new businesses, some of them, you know. And some don't want to go down the academic route. We've got to support them as much as the academics in many ways. It's a whole resource there. We need to tap it.
Well, my view would be if someone's interested in industry, the sooner they go into industry, the better. Because when you come out of college, you have no idea what all the different jobs are available. Like, you can have a BSc degree, let's say microbiology, but there's a whole marketing program you can get to. And you don't really know about that till you get in there. To finish up on a few things, what you and I have discussed a number of times is how do we get more kids interested in science in primary school?
Yeah.
And I know the RDS here do a great job with the Science Blast and always looking for people to support it. What else can we do there? Because it generally, to me, comes down to individual teachers.
Well, you know, we're not doing too bad. Again, I know it sounds like as if everything's very positive, isn't it? But I think it's true. I am the president of the Irish Science Teachers Association. Isn't that correct? Now,
I'm glad I asked that
question. It's a bit
question.
honorary, you know. You get a kind of a gold chain and you turn up for the dinners. There's no meetings happening at the moment. There's a great cohort of science teachers in Ireland. I'll give them a big shout out, no question. They're very dedicated. That's the second level. Now, they got primary teachers come to these conferences occasionally as well. So I think it's pretty good, actually, to be honest. There's a real focus on it, remember?
Yeah.
Science Week last week, all over RTE was great. There were science programs. There was all sorts of things going on. So I think we should just keep the message out there because the appetite is there, remember. And all of us should be conscious of it and doing our best. And the RDS actually does a great... Look at the young scientist. I mean, there's a great example, isn't there? For heaven's sake, for decades. The young scientist is possibly the best in the world, almost, isn't it? And it's famous everywhere.
It's fantastic. I love to go to it every year. I don't know what will happen this year. And his name will escape me, but Monaghan, Dr. Monaghan, who won the first one here in 1965, went on to be a big life science entrepreneur. And
I think with COVID as well, Cormac, you will see a huge upsurge in interest in science anyway, because it's in the news. There's all these scientists, including myself, on the media, and I'm getting loads of emails off young people now. It's called the Brian Cox effect in England, when they all want to do physics, you see. So, and I suspect governments all over the world will invest in science more and more because of this crisis that's happening. So now is the time, in many ways. It couldn't be better, in a way. And Ireland could be perfectly placed now to capitalise on these developments, I think, given all the things we've been discussing.
Well, to finish on COVID, yes, you've seen an enormous number of companies switch their strategy towards COVID, and it's definitely going to activate more science. You've been a great public figure in pushing safety on it. I might ask you to finish with the key things. What should we all be doing?
Yes, are you ready?
Avoid
Can I wash my hands yet again on national media? And I've washed my hands about 20 times on the telly. Well, I mean, let's start with the good news. These two vaccines, tremendous. As you saw yesterday, Moderna's vaccine, 94% efficacious. I mean, that's super, brilliant. The reason why that's so important is that's two separate companies replicating each other. You know, they're both using RNA vaccines. We love replication in science. Independent confirmation this technology can work gangbusters, which is great. Now, until those vaccines arrive, though, keep doing the same things as the usual. Distancing, hand washing, mask wearing, it's as simple as that. And avoid the crowds. If only Ireland could keep doing that, the count will go right down, remember. So let's never miss an opportunity to remind people of these.
No, it's fantastic. And as you tell me, every time you walk past a sanitizer, you use it.
Use it every time you see a sanitizer. Exactly.
Hopefully we'll all be sensitive coming out of level 5 and with Christmas. So, Luke, as always, great chatting with you.
Good chatting to you, Cormac.
I think we're not unhappy, double negative, of where Irish life sciences
We're not unhappy. Is it good? Definitely, maybe. How about that for an answer?
So, thanks very much. John wants to come and ask us a few questions, I believe, that members have been sending in.
Gentlemen, what a fantastic expose of the life sciences in the Irish context, and, of course, the wider context that you hit on. And Professor Luke O'Neill and Dr. Cormac Kilty, many thanks for you to you both for your very special conversation here. We had a very wide range of questions and queries sent in from the extensive online audience. So we'll just pick a few out here, and let's take the first one. As innovators in the biotech arena, I'm conscious that emerging biopharma and biotech drive as the major trials and innovations in life sciences. In this context, I would welcome your view on the ethical issues of affordability and global access to therapies, and in particular, of course, vaccines, and linking this to your current and past academic and business experiences. So perhaps, Cormac, maybe just kick off with you and then
Thanks, Sean.
Luke,
I was hoping you might ask Luke that one, yeah. No, look, we always have this discussion about affordability, and that leads to ethics. But you might remember what I said earlier, that we're in the business of science. I mean, both words are equally important. And then we talked about patients. So we cannot get these new technologies and treatments to patients unless they're backed by a business, and businesses have to make a profit. Unfortunately, we see all the poor businesses in trouble with with COVID-19, who will not make a profit this year. So I have no problem with profit. I have no problem with business. I do believe that most of it is ethical. There may be some overcharging. I wouldn't be up to the level of detail. But Luke will probably mention the idea that most of our pensions invest in pharma companies. So we need companies to make money, and if they don't make money, they go out of business and the patient doesn't get the treatment. But there has to be a balance. I think in general, it's not a bad balance.
There was a great piece in the Business Post last Sunday, John. Did you see it?
I didn't know, no.
Well, the big sectors, big oil is in trouble. Big tobacco was ruined. Big finance was challenged. Big pharma is the last man or woman standing, let's face it. And it's been in trouble for these very topics that you're kind of referring to here. Some are better than others and so on. But big pharma will save us from COVID-19, remember. That's the bottom line. So if you want to get out of COVID-19, you got to work with big pharma. Now, because it's extremely expensive. Like, it's $1.2 billion to develop a new medicine, and they don't even work sometimes and don't reach their market even, So it's not for the faint-hearted as a business to be in. And then, of course, shareholders should be getting returns on risk and so on. It's like any other business in a way. I think medicine and business are always strange bedfellows because there's altruism and greed in the one occupation, kind of. So it's a funny balance. I think the answer is regulation, of course. And as long as these businesses are regulated, and we need regulators in every sector, don't we? Then it should be okay. And some are more ethical than others, I would say. In my new book, which I'm going to plug now, you ready? Never mind the bollocks. There's a chapter called Why Are New Medicines So Expensive? That's the title of the chapter.
Yourself and Trump would do well on that one. He was an interesting advocate for lower costs.
Yeah. But I lay out the whole case for the industry and my view of it in that regard, and how ultimately there are many new medicines coming down the pipeline, John. It's unbelievable progress. For the big diseases, they are going to be expensive. And who's going to pay for them? And cystic fibrosis is a good example in Ireland. That's an expensive drug. And they argue with the company and try to haggle the price down. There's a whole area called health economics, by the way. People specialize in drug pricing. In other words, if you spend 20 grand a year in a drug, but it's going to save you 100 grand in that person's lifetime, it's worth the price, If you're a cystic fibrosis patient, it costs the health service a huge amount of money. A little tablet might save money, So it's a very complicated thing to get right, but it's something everybody's aware of. And of course, you don't want a situation where, academics say, I don't want to go into it because it's unethical. You cannot eat it. That disincentivizes academics then. So it's a really important thing to get right, I think.
Oh, interesting. And our second question coming up, and guys, you may have already covered it. How strong is biotech innovation in Ireland, and what's the potential for the future? Have we covered that, or?
I think we've done a reasonable job.
Yeah, I think an important point here is academics are over. Now, this is going to be me being like a union man. Academics are overworked. The other way unions always complain, my teachers can't go into that classroom. I didn't mean that with other teachers. But, they're overworked, and since I was a young academic, it's got worse for them. They're put upon from everybody. Where would they find the time to innovate or time to commercialize? Because they're overworked at every level. And especially I worry about our young academics, I think. They're unhappy, a lot of them actually. And they're probably not getting paid enough. They're, massive pressure on them from all kinds of people. The pressure to publish from the head of the department. All those metrics are now being used. We need to help them hugely, because if we as we all know, if you overwhelm someone, they won't get the ideas and they won't innovate. So
is there a target? I heard there was a target in most universities now in terms of the amount of publishing you have to do.
Well, you won't get promoted. Let's put it that way. There's a way, it's cart and stick territory in a way, you know. But they're a very well motivated group, and they're very A-type personalities, most of them. They've spent their lives getting PhDs and postdocs, and they want to make a difference. They want to get stuck in and have a career, you know. Burden them with too much admin or too much teaching and too many metrics and filling boxes and bureaucracy is a disaster, you know. Leave them alone is my policy, and they'll do well, that kind of thing. But it's a worry, and they're the seed corn, because the universities should be generating spin-outs. That's one of their missions, stated mission now. We've got to support them to enable them to do that.
Let's hit the next question. How important do you consider the role of the state as a cornerstone investor, through obviously the state agencies and the venture capital companies that they support, in sustaining entrepreneurship in the sector in Ireland?
Yeah, well, we talked again a little bit about that. Can I just go back, John, to you know, what we talked about, trying to find some time. An interesting program we've put together at the Irish Cancer Society is we've created 2 fellowships for physicians to be able to come out of their physician work and spend 2 years in the lab. So you're bringing that level of experience of knowing where it should be applied. And we don't have any, do we, independent research institutes in Ireland.
No.
And that, I think that would be an interesting jump when we finally get the money. Because we're borrowing so much money for COVID at 0 interest rate, maybe we'd do it.
Just on that point, Cormac, is Tyndall Institute not independent?
It could well be.
It's tied to the universities, though. You see, what Ireland's missed, John, is these independent research. Every other country has an independent research freestanding institute, which can hire and fire, have conditions of employment, all that stuff that they decide, right? That's outside Ireland now. In Ireland, it's always been tied to the universities. Yeah. Which has been a slight, now it's worked reasonably well, I must say, but you're better off having an independent institute. It's expensive to set up and so on. But you often see the best innovation comes out of research institutes as opposed to universities, because they aren't burdened with teaching, interestingly. That's one reason, you know. So it's a complicated one.
I think, you know, look, I talked about earlier that in 1973, I think we had our first foreign direct investment. It was at Eli Lilly came to Ireland. So 50 years seems pretty fast. I think we've done pretty well.
Yep.
It's somewhat exponential now,
yeah,
because we're getting so many entrepreneurs coming out. You know, I think the government is doing a lot. They've funded things like Halo, Business Angels Network. There's an angel network in Cork, in Dublin, in Galway. Galway is a fantastic centre for medical devices.
Yep.
And I would say most of the people in that group I'm on it who would invest over there already have worked for a multinational,
yep,
have already spun out at least one company and maybe working on their second company. So there's an enormous amount of expertise available for anyone in universities who wants to spin things out. And I think when you get to serial entrepreneur, that's very important.
Might I just come in there, Cormac? The state is the one aspect, and the other aspect then is getting to the big investor communities. Are we doing enough to move outside Ireland as entrepreneurs, moving into places like the US? You have experience in launching in NASDAQ in the US.
Yeah, I didn't bring Biotech to NASDAQ, by the way. It was the next company, NextVet, with Mark Heffernan, the chap who ran Upsona for us. We're going outside much more. Absolutely much more. There was very little money around in the 80s. Particularly our IT colleagues, they go to America almost first, to Silicon Valley. We have some really very big investor groups on the continent we can go talk to. So I don't think Irish people are afraid about going abroad to look for the money. But the support here is very good. I think if there's one thing I would ask, I mean, it was interesting, I was looking at the finalist of the final of the Ernst & Young Entrepreneur last Thursday night, Zoomed, and the Minister of Finance talked about, you know, how good we are and so on and so forth. But we have very, very poor tax incentives for people to recycle their money. They're much better in the UK. And it's nice to make some money. Almost everybody reinvests. But an awful lot more would be reinvested, and maybe earlier with more risk if there was more tax incentive.
Yeah.
There's a virtuous circle here.
We're very slow on that.
John, this question has been kicking around for a long time, by the way. What's the state's role in funding research? There was always a virtuous circle. The state would fund the really high-risk basic research because there's other benefits to do education and other things in it. And then you might get a bit of IP and a company forms that might get investment. And they, of course, then a big pharma might be involved and they pay tax back to the exchequer, you see. So the money kind of circulates, was the old model. And big pharma goes, it's not our job to fund basic research, it's the government's job. We can exploit it, but then we pay tax back into the system, that kind of idea, you know. And in fact, with Inflazome, there was a real virtuous circle there because the NCMA, you know, the ISIF, they invested in Fountain. And they got then a return because Fountain obviously was one of our key investors, and that goes back to the exchequer, you see. So there's ways for money to recycle through the system that begins with state funding, giving rise to private investment that then eventually comes back to the state. There's ways to do it.
You did a trade sale, shall we say, as your exit mechanism, something which gets a lot of criticism, shall we say, by the state agencies who believe we should hang on a bit longer. So what's your view, Luke, on that? And you know, what was your logic behind?
In pharma, it's the only way to do it. There's no other option, really, in a sense. I mean, to take a drug to market is going to cost you 1.1 billion, okay? Companies can't raise that kind of money in almost any country, let alone Ireland. So the model is always an exit, because then the investors get their return and they can reinvest. In our case, the state gets some of that return as well. What it doesn't do is create jobs. That's where the criticism lies, you know, because obviously if you, like, why couldn't we have turned Inflazome into a massive, big multinational pharma company? These days, nobody does that, you know. The exit is the mechanism, sadly. At one level it's sad, another way it's the way to do it.
You sold you're a serial seller of your company.
I have no problem with serial selling.
So why do you exit so many?
Well, first of all, one wants to make some money. There's no doubt. If you've been grinding away for 15 years, I think Biotech was an overnight success. It just took 15 years. And your family supporting you and so on. So everybody needs to take some money off the table at some stage, that's for sure. One doesn't need that much, but one needs some. I think it's horses for courses, John. We hear about the companies that have been sold, but when I look at my 500 fellow Ernst & Young entrepreneurs, many of them have kept their companies and growing to 200 and 300 people. So we don't hear about the guys who keep going in all sorts of sectors, supported by Enterprise Ireland. And some have to be sold exactly for Luke's reasons, or for cash. I mean, my last company, Argudis Medical, we had some difficulty raising cash. We sold it to a company in the UK for, I can say, a relatively small amount of money. They took one of our lead biomarkers, spun it out into a new company in the States for early detection of kidney damage and diabetes. And because of the insurance funding ecosystem in the United States, we're able to move very quickly for reimbursement. Our company is worth $280 million today. I don't really own very much of it at all, but it's fantastic to see that product going to the patient. And we would not have been able to do it in Ireland. I would not have been able to do that project here, that's for sure.
And it's the VC model, and remember, John, the VCs want exits. That's their strategy. If you can raise money off someone else, it mightn't be an exit, but in my business, it's only VC money that can support you. So you're caught in that loop. I do take the point, though, that the government would like more companies to grow, to scale, but certainly in the life sciences, biotech sector, it's extremely rare. And that everybody knows that, you just accept that as the way to.
I would say overall, Luke, we probably haven't done too bad at the scaling across all the sectors. And life sciences has riskier challenges, I think, there's no doubt. I mean, some of our IP colleagues, the software companies, so on, they can start and fail very quickly. You know, this great Silicon Valley thing, fail quickly and then start again. It takes a while to figure out you might fail in life sciences, and that consumes money and so on and so forth.
Because in pharma biotech, the big companies want to acquire. That's part of their business model as well, remember. I think Roche, in our case, most of their assets are 60% are bought in, remember. So that's their model too. In other words, there's a market to sell into as well. And of course,
which is very
foolish not to go after that if you're an investor, wouldn't you?
Well, we're running somewhat out of time, guys, and I'd like to thank all the people who sent in a phenomenal range of queries and questions. Unfortunately, we're not going to get around to them all, but we have a final question for Luke first, and then we'll take one final question then for Cormac. So, Luke, you had a vision and a tenacity to deliver on your entrepreneurial vision. Did you depend on others for your financial skills?
Absolutely. I mean, as I said, it does take a city of people to achieve this, John, in so many ways. And without Mark Heffernan as a kickoff, and Cormac's advice at the start was key to this. And then you bring in people, and what do we say, 80% of success in life is your interpersonal activities as opposed to your skill set, really. Like, the technical stuff's important. In my view, being a great scientist, you just make the cut, okay? The rest of it is so important. And I had to trust them, and they trust me. And I wouldn't be au fait with the contractual end of this is extremely complicated, by the way. And I had great trust. And I'd mentioned Fountain again, they were great advisors to me. So you do need trust, and you need to respect each other, actually, and rate each other ultimately, and be part of a team. I mean, it's almost like a rock band, if that's the analogy I can use. Like I could be John Lennon, and I've got Paul McCartney beside me, you know, and you're both together in this. But you need that. An academic cannot do it. I mean, any academics who are looking at me and going, I want to be like that guy, I only did it because of all these other people. And I'm talking about 5, 6, 7 people in this story, really, who are all as important as me.
You need the roadies behind you.
Well, people say to me, oh, you must be disappointed you didn't get the lion's share of the money. Well, how could I? Because they needed me, I need them just as much, you know. And dare I say it, including the lawyers, even though I was saying earlier. You need all these different skill sets to make it. It's a very complicated thing to do, actually.
And Cormac, a final question, if I might, coming in there. In relation to the welcome news of the vaccine approvals, question in is, what is your view on the need for transparency in global vaccine licensing agreements, and who gets priority access? You're aware of, I'm sure, that 85% of the initial Pfizer vaccine has already been promised, or should I say, committed to the high-income countries.
Yeah. Now, I really think Luke should answer this, but because he's involved in it. But yeah, I mean, all of these things cost money. Trump, one of the things he did do was pay a lot of money forward to have the vaccines manufactured well in advance of trials. That was a risk. So those with the largest amount of money who have facilitated the rapid production, I have no problem that they will get some access. But Luke will say we have 20 or more companies in the world developing vaccines. Yep. I don't think it'll be very long before we have full access.
It's remarkable what's happening, John, because first of all, as I said earlier, Big Pharma has to survive this. Okay, Big Tobacco's gone. Okay. Big Pharma is now, the spotlight has never been as harsh on Big Pharma ever in the history of this sector, because the whole world is desperate to get out of this mess that we're in. So they've got to behave in a different way. They're collaborating. Pfizer licensed off BioNTech, for example. AstraZeneca is the Oxford vaccine. And like GSK are giving their adjuvant, which is the key add-in to any vaccine, to several companies. That'll be unprecedented in the past. So massive collaborations happening. Secondly, every government is investing in these companies. Ireland wouldn't be, but the EU is massively. The US government have given billions into this Operation Warp Speed. The UK government are giving a lot of money into these companies. It's a public-private partnership, absolutely. Even Pfizer, they didn't take part in Warp Speed, but they still got some investment from the US government, you see. So who pays next now? It has to be free, right? Because we've already paid for it, you see. Now, if we go beyond a year, these companies are in there for the long haul, go to year 2 or 3, then you're going to start. The pricing structure will change by then, and the companies want to recoup some of their investment as well, remember. But watch this, it's going to be very interesting to see what happens. It wouldn't surprise me if these vaccines aren't free for quite a long time. And secondly, for the developing world, the CEPI, who is a very important philanthropic agency that distributes vaccines to the developing world, and COVAX, which is kind of, again, a state philanthropic organisation, they've got 50 countries on their list already to give vaccines to those countries. So I wouldn't worry about this question at all. I think these vaccines will be ethically distributed to the world, at least for the first year or two anyway, and then let's see what happens next.
Thank you, gentlemen, for a fascinating conversation. Thank you at home and in the office for joining us today, and for providing those thought-provoking questions, many of which unfortunately we were not able to fit in today. Please join us for next month's RDS Vision 2030 series, which features the future of retail, and then again in the new year for the conversation with EU Commissioner Mairead McGuinness. We expect to be using these studios here for some time yet, before we can return to the in-person meetings that you'd all be familiar with. So please subscribe to the RDS YouTube channel to be kept informed of these events and other events coming down the line. Or you can email enterprise@rds.ie to join the mailing list. Once again, my thanks to Professor Luke O'Neill and to Dr. Cormac Kilty for a fascinating discussion here this morning. And from all of us here at the RDS Studios, stay safe and keep well.